Yeah, Aditya, are you there? Aditya missed the lectures. Okay. If you haven't seen the lectures, then it's going to be a bit difficult in this session, even if there are questions from others. Let's see. Harsha, you can type or unmute. Either way, did you see the lectures on data visualization and analysis?
No, sir.
No. How about Biju? Okay, Biju's gone through the lectures. Krishnendu?
Yes, one lecture I saw yesterday for this time, but last year I went through all the lectures.
I see. You were there last year as well. Okay. Okay, it's a long time ago, so I won't remember, I'm sure. Rishikesh? Somebody needs to mute. NPTEL team, can you mute your microphone? Let's see if I can mute them. Okay, I was able to mute. Rishikesh, are you there? Punraj? No. Venus Michael. Did you see the lectures for this week? Radhika? No. Radhika, what about HI? I don't know what that stands for. Okay. HI has watched the lectures. Okay, so those of you who have watched, I think it's just a couple of you. All right, for those who haven't watched, basically, let me say that so most of the topics that I've been dealing with have been what we might call meta topics, no, not specifically about birds and ornithology, but more generally about how one does research. So asking questions, study design, and then these lectures on visualization and analysis. So if you are an amateur who's here in the course, I mean, who's just here for the love of birds and you don't intend to do any research, then it's perfectly fine to skip these lectures. Of course, there are questions from them in the assignments and the final exam. If you're a research student, if you're involved in research in any way, then I think it's a bit important to engage with these kinds of topics. They are not the kinds of topics that we normally learn about in our higher education. I was not taught these in bachelor's, master's, or PhD for that matter. A little bit about analysis and visualization in master's and PhD, but in a very old-fashioned kind of way. So, and the reason that they're important is that, of course, we're here to make sense of data. We're here to try and understand about the world. And that's why we collect information in a structured way. But we collect information in a structured way in order to answer questions. And the structure of how we collect information is specifically tailored, should be tailored to answering the particular questions that we have. And then when you collect the information, you need to make sense of it. And usually this is in the form of quantitative data. So in my teaching and so on, I deal with quantitative analysis, not qualitative analysis, which is quite different, which in some of the social sciences, we deal with qualitative data. But when you're dealing with quantitative data, it becomes very important and very, it's a bit of an art actually to deal with data. How do we extract meaning from data? How do we try and avoid pitfalls of being misled by the data and coming to conclusions that are not supported by the data or potentially are completely wrong? And this is possible, and it does happen all the time in science, including in the published literature. There are many, some might argue the majority of published papers have flaws and errors in their data analysis and interpretation. So if you do want to contribute to science through research, then I think these are important topics to engage with, even if they are a bit difficult. And even if we came into biology because we didn't like maths, maths is really essential for any kind of research. And so, so you would have seen in the lectures, those who've seen the lectures, that there's some mathematical notation, there's some mathematical ideas at the level that I have dealt with. There's nothing very complicated. It's mostly just either arithmetic, so adding, subtracting, squaring, and so on, or at the most, there's a bit of algebra, like in the linear equations and the equation of a line, and we have to understand what the different components of those are. So that's just an overall exhortation to you to engage a little bit in detail, and if the lectures seem difficult or complex, please do try and watch them again, try and relate them to any kind of data collection, any kind of data set that you might have. Try and apply maybe some of the ideas to those data sets so it becomes more real in your mind rather than some hypothetical thing. Yeah, that's all I suppose I have to say. If there are, I mean, anybody can type questions at any time. But also because we're a small group today, you're also welcome to just unmute and ask. Yeah, so I'll wait for a little while for questions.
Yes, I do have one.
Yes,
actually.
Krishnendu, yeah.
Would you please give a bit of explanation in the differences between standard errors and standard deviation, and this involvement of degrees of freedom in while defining what's a variation? I always get confused with these things. I mean, how does the degree of freedom come into play in this?
Yeah. So I think all I can do is repeat what I said. I think it's in the first lecture. I recorded the lecture in one bit, but then we divided into two because they're very long. So in the first part, I think conceptually the most important thing to understand the difference is the conceptual difference between standard deviation and standard error. So when we have collected some data and we want to describe the variation in that data, and remember when we have collected data on, let's say, heights of trees or clutch sizes of birds, we've gone and measured 50 trees, or we've gone and looked at 40 nests. Remember that the data you collect aren't the be-all and end-all. The sample that you took of 40 nests or 50 trees is just a sample from the larger population. And we don't care so much about that particular sample. If I had gone the next day or had gone to a slightly different area, I would have collected a different set of 50 trees and different set of 40 nests. So usually what we want to do is we only care about our particular sample, our particular data set, to the extent that it tells us something about the population. The population meaning the set of unmeasured trees or unmeasured nests, because we have only taken a very small sample from the population. So if our purpose, so what can we try and understand about the population? First, we can try and understand something about, let's say, the mean tree height or the mean clutch size. And our best estimate of and we don't know, of course, what the mean of the population is, right? Because we have not and cannot measure all the trees of this particular species in this area. We can't measure all the nests. If we can measure, by the way, all the trees and all the nests, then that's a great situation and we should do it. But in the vast majority of cases, we can't. So the first thing we might know is what is the mean tree height, or is the mean clutch size, or the mean of whatever else, the mean grass cover in a plot, or the mean ratio of males to females in this population, but of course we have only collected some small number of males and females or small number of plots and so on. So we collect the mean. So that's one, remember, that's called the population parameter. What we measured is the sample estimate, and we want to try our best guess of the population parameter as the sample estimate. So that is the mean. Then another attribute of the population is the variation in the population. And that attribute of the population is also, we hope, captured in the sample. If the population has lots of variation, then presumably, hopefully, if the sample is representative, then the sample also would have a lot of variation. And so if we collect a large enough sample size, 30, 40, 50, whatever it is, then we should be able to see a variation. We may be able to infer something about the population level variation from the sample variation, just like we try and infer about the population level mean from the sample mean. So, so to measure the variation, we use the standard deviation, right? That's one measure of the variation, which is the square of each value from the mean of all the values, the square of the difference between each value and the mean value, divided by the sample size and take the square root of that. And so, and that's where the degrees of freedom come in. If we have measured every single individual in the population, then we just divide by the sample size, the number of individuals in that population. If we have taken only a sample, then statistically, a better estimate of statistically a better estimate of the population deviation is the the population standard deviation is the sample standard deviation as calculated using the degrees of freedom in the denominator, which is in this case n-1, and it's n-1 because we have lost 1 degree of freedom in the process of calculating the mean. So there's an example in the lecture about how we can think of degrees of freedom, where if you have a set of numbers, let's say 5 numbers, then there are 5 degrees of freedom because those numbers could be anything. But once I have calculated the mean of those 5 numbers, and if I know what the mean of those 5 numbers is, then only 4 of those numbers are free to vary as I want. And if I guess 4 of those numbers, the 5th one is fixed because it's only with a given 5th number, then that would also result in the mean, the same mean that I calculated earlier. This is said in a more coherent way in the lecture. So the degrees of freedom are what is remaining in terms of how freely the data are to vary, how much freedom the data have to vary after certain parameters have been calculated, for example, the mean. And later on, when we talk about regression, we note that when we calculate the predictions of y from x, we have lost 2 degrees of freedom because we don't just predict y from the mean of x, we predict y from both the intercept and slope of the regression line. So we lose 2 degrees of freedom, and then when we calculate the residual standard deviation, then we have to do so with the degrees of freedom n-2. Okay, that's all I'll say about that. And then the difference between standard deviation, standard error. Standard deviation is just a description of the variation in the population as estimated by your sample, whereas the standard error is something much more significant. The standard error is a measure of how close or how far your sample mean is likely to be from the population mean. So if the standard error is small, then we have more confidence that the sample mean is close to the population mean. When the standard error is high, then we have less such confidence. So the sample mean could be quite far from the population mean. And exactly how far is when we convert the standard error into a confidence interval, for example, a 95% confidence interval. Then we would then we try and put actual numbers, and we say the 95% confidence interval is between 15 and 25. Then we have, crudely speaking, we have a 95% probability that the population mean lies within 15, the interval of 15 and 25. And it's the standard error that determines how broad your confidence interval is, not the standard deviation. And of course, the standard error is related to the standard deviation with some assumptions. The standard error is standard deviation divided by root of n. So the standard error is proportional to the standard deviation, but we can always achieve higher precision, that means reduce our standard error, if we have a larger sample size for a given standard deviation. Excuse me for 1 minute, I'm just going to stop this dog from barking. Just give me a minute. Sorry. Okay, so that was, I mean, it's hard to explain this without visuals, but again, if you look at the lecture once more, try to explain it. And if it's still not clear, maybe you could post a question in the discussion forum, and I can point you to some more resources to explore and understand better.
Thank you. I think one more reading will do. And if time allows and not too many questions flow in, may I allowed to ask a real life situation where we can actually we need to form a problem out of a forest patch where a particular problem exists. I mean, shall I reserve it for the later part of the discussion if nothing flows in?
Just go ahead, Krishnendu, and then if others want, they can always type in the message box.
Okay, so we have a Sal forest, that's a reserve forest. And every year I have seen for the past 10 years, I had to cross this area to get to my college. This leaf litter was burnt. But very recently I came to know this is primarily for the reason of jungle fowl hunting. I mean, we do have a sizable population of red jungle fowl there. So there are several techniques involved, and now the authorities, they have approached some of the people to make an assessment of the situation. And what I thought this could they do not know about other birds, I mean other forest birds nesting in the mid-story or the shrubs that grow to a particular height. I mean the primary thing of the hunters is to get jungle fowl. There are many techniques involved, so we just wanted to pinpoint to whether taking adequate measures to save the stop hunting of red jungle fowl without could actually result in protecting the forest patch and so that other birds nesting activities could continue undisturbed. So that's a very brief description of the situation. I do not know how much clarity I have achieved in. So how do we approach the situation and what variables to consider in forming, I mean, very crudely speaking, the null hypothesis and all that?
No, I think, Krishna, you described the context in which you're operating, but you need to narrow down what the research question is a little bit more for me. So, what in a research study in that area, what is your question? What are you trying to find out?
I wanted to find out whether if the measures to protect red jungle fowl are put in place very strongly, that includes stopping of burning of the leaf litter that is usually forms in the forest floor. The plantations are sal plantations, and there are a lot of other birds who nest in the shrubs that grow underneath the trees, and so the question is protection of the forests. There are not too many mammal species that are found. These are primarily you get only bird life, maybe one or two lizards and all that, but not very significant. But bird life is forest birds, passerines and all that, even hornbills, owls, 6 species of owls, they are available. So the protection of the forests, can it be brought down to significantly brought down to the level of protection of red jungle fowl? I mean, stopping hunting of red jungle fowl and burning of leaf litter, can it be brought down to it?
Can it be brought down is not a research question. No, it's a management question or implementation question. No, can you stop hunting of jungle fowl? Correct?
No, I mean, I'm not articulate enough. I understand. I mean, if we do, I mean, is it scientifically achievable to understand if we do protect red jungle fowl, will it suffice in protecting other bird species that reside in that area?
I see. Yeah. No, I think this is useful to go back and forth a little bit, Krishnendu, because I think that whenever we are in the early stages of formulating a project, it does take time and effort to kind of crystallize a clear question, research question, in a specific enough manner that it becomes clear what the next step is. Broad questions or issues typically cannot be addressed by research. They need to be somehow broken down into some specifics and then each of those specifics can be tackled. So, for example, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying, um, if there are measures put in place to protect red jungle fowl, would those also have the additional effect of protecting or promoting other bird species in the habitat?
Yes.
And then, of course, you would want to think, okay, what are these measures to protect red jungle fowl? One measure may be just to go around searching for snares or knocking on people's doors and finding hunters and so on. So if those hunters are only hunting jungle fowl, then obviously that might help the jungle fowl, but won't help anybody else because these people are not hunting other birds. But another measure that you suggested is to prevent forest fires. And so then the question becomes, do the fires that hunters set, do they negatively affect, so it's kind of the inverse, but do the fires negatively affect other birds? And therefore, by stopping the fires, by inference, by stopping the fires, would we benefit those other birds? Is that
Yes, because the smaller birds, I mean, kind of tailor birds or other bulbuls and all that, which nest in the downs, the shrubs that grow under the sal trees, it's completely burnt out. The technique for catching, one of the techniques for catching jungle fowl is you hear them and you try to pinpoint the location and set a fire at one side of the hillock so that it keeps burning, and jungle fowl move to one side, where to the other side where people have set traps, snares and nets. This is some kind of nets, and sorry. So these come and they wait with slingshots and guns. Either they shoot down these birds or they get trapped in the trap set for them. So this is one technique that actually destroys the whole forest, and the whole nesting activity of the season is gone. And it is being practiced year after year.
So and I guess it's done around this time, dry season, and this is around the time that nesting also happens. So there are a few things that need to coincide. So, for example, somebody who doesn't know about the system would ask, okay, firstly, is this happening during the nesting period of these other birds? So that's more a natural history observation, and one would say yes or no depending on what the situation was.
Now that most birds are nesting or in courtship display, the area is completely gone. It's a huge area. It's completely gone. So no nesting will happen there. So we have an eco park adjacent to it. We do get nests there.
No, I'm trying to break down the research question. So your particular the conservation motivation, I understand, but I'm just trying to say, suppose there was this research question, there would be firstly some pre-existing information that one would bring to it. So first is, okay, do the seasons coincide of the burning and the nesting? And then there would be some indication that yes, they coincide. If they don't coincide, then it may be a different situation. But that's one thing. The second thing, some pre-existing information or information that you might need to gather is what fraction of the habitat is this burning affecting. So you said whole forest just now. It would be useful to have some actual numbers, actually, satellite imagery or other kind of surveys on the ground. Because again, one would imagine that if, let's say, the fraction of forest burnt was 5%.
I will just interrupt you a bit here. It is the trees are not getting affected. These are grown-up trees. The canopy is intact. The canopy is not affected at all. It's only the ground that is impacted.
I was assuming that, Krishnendu. I was just saying what fraction of the area of the forest. So, for example, if only 2 to 5% of the area of the forest is affected, then 95% of the habitat remains for those other birds to nest in, which is probably not a very big effect.
It's on the other hand, I should say it's a very reserved, even if I give a very reserved account, it's close to 80%.
Yeah, sure, Krishnendu. I'm trying to get to the logic of asking the question rather than the specifics of, you'll have the answers to these, you'll have the answer to these questions, to these points. But I'm trying to make a more general point about how you might take a larger research question and break it down into smaller pieces, which then would require either some collecting information that's pre-existing or maybe some additional information. So you'd want to know the season, you want to know the extent of the what fraction of the forest is affected. And then you might say, okay, fine, it's a large enough issue that we need to be concerned about. And then you might put in place some kind of study design where you want to compare, let's say, burnt and unburnt areas. So if the burning is affecting the populations of other species, then in those parts of the forest which are burnt, you might expect fewer birds. Not while they're being burnt, of course, but down the line. Let's say 6 months down the line or 8 months down the line, you might expect less density of those other species compared to those some parts of the forest that have not been burnt. So what I'm just as a to summarize, you take that broad level goal that you have to understand the effect of burning on non-target species, let's call them that. Then you bring together different pieces of evidence, different sources of information to try and weave together a story that gives you the overall picture. What precisely those individual pieces of information are, that will depend on the question and the local circumstance and so on. But that's roughly how it needs to be. But each of those components has to be very specific. So, for example, you might need to say, okay, to answer my goal, one objective is, okay, do the seasons coincide? Then I have to do something to figure out if the seasons coincide. Then another objective would be, what fraction of the forest is burnt typically? Then I need another set of activities to figure out what fraction of it. Then in that fraction which is burnt, does the burning result in fewer birds 6 months down the line? So then I need a comparison between burnt and unburnt areas. And there will be more such objective level questions. If you remember the lecture on asking and answering questions, where the overall goal of the project was broken down into different objectives, and the objectives themselves into different tasks. And that is what allows us to become specific about what we need to do in the field or in the lab or on the computer, whatever, what information we need to gather, and then be able to stitch it back all together so that we can try and come to an overall conclusion about that goal level question.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I will try to make one. I mean, in case I face any difficulties, can I communicate this to you? But I was trying to make a question out of an actual real life situation. That was my target. I mean,
yes. No, I mean, that's exactly what we want to do in research. We want to, research is not happening in some hypothetical scenario. It's happening on the ground. So yes. And as I say, if you're struggling with it, just be reassured that everybody struggles with it. Everybody struggles to take an initial idea and then shape it into a form that becomes then tractable to answer through some research design. It is a struggle all the time, and so don't feel disheartened if it does take some back and forth and does take some effort to do so.
May I ask an offbeat question here? I mean, the statistical calculations that you make or someone who is doing research makes, is it done through softwares like R or there was one, I mean, SPSS or something like that? I mean,
yeah, typically, because typically we're dealing with the data in the large numbers. Earlier, when we had small data sets, 20, 30, then one could do things by hand. But typically we'll use a software like R. I advocate using R, not Excel or not SPSS or one of those other point-and-click software. R is a programming language and statistical software in the same interface. So
is it very difficult to learn?
No, it's not very difficult. It depends. If you've done some programming in the past, then it'll be very easy. Even if you haven't,
no, my programming knowledge is almost zero. I mean, I must admit it.
There are many R tutorials out there, and you can just start from scratch and do and see how far you get. I don't think it's too difficult.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. So Ponraj is asking a question just to move on. Is there any system change in bird census? Ponraj, what do you mean by system change? Can you unmute and say or type?
Hello. Yeah, this is Ponraj here.
Yes, Ponraj.
I want to know that is there any change in the census type? No, like because it is very few birds are there in the field. So is there any change in the census type?
In the way of doing the census,
yeah, way of doing it, right?
Yeah. That's an interesting point and very relevant, actually, more relevant to research design, but that's okay. Because when you want to monitor populations of birds or anything else over time, we need to use the same method. if we change the methods, then it becomes difficult to compare. So, in the case of vultures, from the 1990s, early 1990s, they have been doing something called road transects in central India and northern India, Madhya Pradesh, Gujarat, Rajasthan, I think parts of Jharkhand as well, Bihar. So BNHS has been doing road transects, and by and large they've been following the same method. So driving the same stretch of road. The reason they drive is because vulture densities are low. So you have to cover large distances. You can't do that just walking. So you have to cover large distances to be able to count enough vultures. So, and of course, they're becoming less and less. So, so they cover the same stretches of road in the same time of year. So the effort is the same, the locations are the same, and that is how we have a very good understanding that vulture populations have declined by, in some cases, 99.8%. But if the method had changed in between, then we wouldn't be able to make such a strong conclusion. So it's important that when these monitoring projects are started, that they are started with enough care and thought, that the method is well designed, so that it can be carried out into the years and decades in the future. So that's what's happening there, Konraj. And of course, in other parts of the country where this is not happening, for example, in South India and Tamil Nadu, in Karnataka and Kerala, there is a different method. It is not a road transect based, as far as I understand, but I'm not so aware of that method. But because it's a different method, that the results from those censuses cannot be simply added to, or cannot be simply compared with the census from central and northern India. So the two different methods make them incomparable.
So not possible to compare with this data, right? From the southern data and northern data, is not possible to compare then.
If the methods are different, it's not possible to compare. What may be possible to compare is over time, if we calculate in the north, let's say there is some 50% decline over 10 years using one method, and in the south, using another method, let's say we find over 10 years there's a 20% decline, then those declines may be comparable. The rate of decline, we may be able to say that there's a higher decline in northern than south, or the other way around. The declines we could potentially compare, because the declines themselves are calculated from the same method, if you know what I mean. Within each area, they're using the same method and comparing over one decade what the percentage changes. But the absolute numbers cannot be added or compared, in my understanding, if the methods are sufficiently different.
Okay, so they can't declare the number of individuals, right, in India. Is it not possible, right?
I know it's not possible. How is it possible? Because the counts are carried out over a very small fraction of India's landscape, and it's not done in a representative way. In some other countries, when they do bird census, bird monitoring studies, of course, no country can cover 100% of its area, and nor is it needed.
Okay.
But the area that they cover has to be scattered across the country in a way that is representative of the country as a whole. So right now in the north, they're carrying the census out in places which they know have high vulture density. Near protected areas in Madhya Pradesh, for example. Madhya Pradesh is a stronghold of vultures because it has such a large area under protected forests, and therefore fewer livestock which can be contaminated with diclofenac. So it's not representative what they're getting. They know in the stronghold of the vulture, this is what the declines that's happening. And in southern India, as far as I understand, again, the censuses are not carried out all across southern India. They're carried out in this particular Mudumalai, Bandipur, Wayanad landscape, which is known to have a remnant population of vultures. So whatever can be said about vultures in South India you can only make a conclusion about that particular small area, that small part of South India. You can't say about the rest of South India, because the rest of South India is not being sampled. It's not being measured and counted. So one has to be very cautious, I think, about making generalizations based on the information that's collected from a small, area that is not representative of the rest of the landscape.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, welcome. Okay, I've been drawing out my answers because there aren't any other questions. But so if there are other questions, please do ask by unmuting or typing. Others, we can draw it to an early close. Remember, there's always the option of typing questions in the discussion forum. And I'll do my best to answer them there. Yeah, it doesn't have to be restricted to these live interactions. Sonia, you still? Yeah, Sonia's there, no? Sonia, shall we
sure.
draw to an end then? And then we can always have questions in discussion forum if there are other questions.
Yeah, that is also fine. Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
We can.
Great. All right. Thank you all. Thank you, Krishnendu Ponraj, for the questions, and looking forward to further interactions. All the best for the final exam for those of you who are registered.
Thank you.
Hope
Is there
you're
going
enjoying
to
the
be a
course.
date change? As we have received a mail, it could be on 28th as well.
So this is a NPTEL matter. I don't personally know. NPTEL will be the ones who inform you. It's not in our hands. That is in the faculty members' hands. So I'm not aware.
And so in 1 or 2 days time, I think NPTEL will answer this thing. So I have already requested them to address the questions related to the exams and all. So yeah.
So just one more question. I mean, is there? I mean, these statistical derivations. I'm interested in the derivations as well. So can you suggest a book where I can find all these? I mean, in a lucid manner.
I'll have to think about that and get back to you, Krishnendu. I don't know of an accessible place which does so in a simple way. Derives these. I mean, anything beyond the mean, no, like standard deviation, standard error, things like that. I'm not aware immediately. I'll have to look and see. If I do find a suitable source, then I'll.
Studied in our graduation, but I forgot that was very long back. So I don't have those books because I have discontinued statistics. So I am also interested in getting to the core of those derivations and how are this related and all that. So if you could,
Okay.
I mean, it's not a time-bound thing. If something comes by, please let me know.
Sounds good. Yeah. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, Krishna. All right. Thank you, everybody. Yeah. Bye. Thanks, Sonia.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.